Thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present on outcomes of this new pilot model for peer review that we've been testing out at Cell Press for the last couple of years. And so before I get into the results and the outcomes of the study, just a quick overview on what is Cell Press Community Review. And it's a new model for peer review that allows for simultaneous consideration of a manuscript at up to 20 Cell Press life and medical sciences journals in a single submission. And the goal that we had for implementing this peer review model was to improve author experience and success, really to try and help authors find the right journal for their submission quickly, and also the chance of then ultimately getting published. And also for, in our own part, to increase our editorial efficiency and reduce the amount of times that editors from different journals are handling and reading the same paper after if it's being transferred within multiple journals. And so just a quick overview of the community review timeline. We launched this as a pre-pilot in September of 2020. And during that time, that initial 4 months, the submissions were all coming from Cell submissions where an author had requested co-consideration with another Cell Press journal. And then in the first half of last year, we then gradually rolled that out to the full Cell Press Life and Medical Sciences portfolio. And then starting in this year, we also have shifted our workflows quite a bit and to try and help the scalability of this peer review model. And so just a brief overview of what this workflow looks like. We have authors, instead of submitting their paper to a single Cell Press journal, they submit to community review and they indicate journals that they're interested in being considered at. The paper is then still assigned to a single handling editor, either a dedicated community editor or an editor from one of the journals. And then they read the paper and coordinate communication with the other editors of requested journals, or potentially also other journals that weren't requested that by our editorial evaluations we think could be a good fit. And then they convey that collective feedback to the authors on which journals would be interested in reviewing the manuscript versus not. And then at that point, authors, if they agree and want to move forward for 2 or more journals, that is then reviewed via community review and sent out to a single set of reviewers that reviews it for the multiple journals all in one go. If a paper at that point is only going to be reviewed by a single journal, we transfer it out directly to that journal to proceed with peer review there. And an author might not agree or want to move forward with any of the journals that we have offered them peer review for, and they are able to withdraw to submit elsewhere. And then after peer review, we get them delineated options for revisions for the different journals so that they have kind of information about what level of experiments would be needed to, in revisions for the different journals involved. And some just initial, author feedback we've gotten on this from the research community is that, there seems to be a lot of interest in these types of, in this type of peer review model. We've had in a survey of authors upon submission, we have authors letting us know that they are interested in being considered across a variety of high quality journals, all within that single submission. And with the really focus being on the potential efficiency and publication time, and the ability to be co-considered. We also surveying authors that ended up transferring out of community review, being peer reviewed at a single journal. We do have 91% of those authors saying that they would recommend this as a submission mechanism. And we have 11% of our authors have submitted multiple papers through community review. And so now getting into the actual kind of study design and what we were trying to evaluate, comparing the outcomes of these papers submitted to community review versus direct submissions to those 20 participating journals. We're comparing the peer review rate, the accept rate, and the publication timeline of papers that were submitted between September 2020 and May 2022. And looking at community review, we're considering all direct submissions as well as the submissions that came via Cell that were primary research articles. The papers that were transferred out to a single journal for peer review are still being considered when we think about the review and accept rates. For the direct submissions to participating journals, we're looking at global unique manuscript submissions submitted throughout those 20 participating journals. And the submissions that originate from community review are excluded from those. And then when thinking about the publication timelines for community review, we're looking at the initial submission date through the final acceptance date at the ultimate receiving journal. And for the direct submissions, we're looking at, again, the initial submission date through the final acceptance date at whatever final journal that paper may have been published at. There are, some inherent limitations of this analysis. The first being that outcomes of articles where an author didn't use an article transfer link to transfer their paper. We're no longer able to fully track kind of the history of those papers. When we're looking at the direct submissions to the participating journals, one of the journals that's a community review journal is iScience, and that's a journal from Cell Press that publishes both physical sciences in addition to life and medical sciences. And so since community review is only looking at life and medical sciences, some of those papers are not really a good direct comparison. If a paper had any history prior to when we were pulling the data in September 2020, we're not able to account for that history. And then also we're assuming that authors that transfer out of community review to be reviewed at a single journal are actually following through and with their full transfer and completing the transfer and being reviewed at that journal. And so the results of this analysis, so we see during this time, community review had 1,674 submissions, of which we offered review at one or more journals for 1,237 of these. So that's about 74% OT review offer rate. For those papers, 595 authors agreed to the review plan. So that's 35, roughly 35.5% of the initial of the total submissions. And just a quick note that that number is slightly different than the number in the abstract that we initially submitted, because we found an error in accounting for a few manuscripts. And that at that same time, looking at direct submissions to the journals, there was 41,638 unique submissions, of which 13,615 were reviewed. So that's 32% of the total submissions. So when we're looking at how many papers were reviewed between community review and direct journal submissions, we do see that there was significantly higher proportion of manuscripts being sent to review. And then when we look of those reviewed manuscripts that had a final outcome at the time of this analysis, looking at how many of those ended up accepted versus rejected, we don't see a significant difference between the community review submitted manuscripts or direct journal submissions. So that kind of tells us that once a paper is out to review, it's being evaluated by peer reviewers to the same standards as far, because we're not seeing a post-review accept rate difference. And now also as part of this analysis, we looked at the publication timeline for papers submitted to community review versus those direct journal submissions. And for the direct journal submissions, we've stratified this by the number of editorial reject and transfer cycles a manuscript had gone through in its lifetime. And so we see from this analysis that while it's a little faster for articles that were directly submitted to a journal that end up accepted in that initial journal, community review publication timeline, the average timeline of about 200 days, is comparable to papers that underwent at least one cycle of editorial reject and transfer. Now, since we did this analysis for the abstract submission, we went back and kind of did a further updated analysis, thinking about some of those limitations that we were thinking that we encountered during our initial work. And some of the caveats we tried to address are thinking about looking only from submissions from January 2021, instead of including those submissions from the pre-pilot stage, because papers submitted during that stage only originated from Cell, and therefore they weren't really representative comparison to papers submitted across the entire 20 journal portfolio during that same time window. Also, we excluded papers that were initially directly submitted to iScience, partly because, as I mentioned, a lot of those submissions would also include physical sciences papers that aren't a good direct comparison. And also, authors submitting their paper to community review are never being considered solely only for iScience. They're also being considered for the other tiers of journals. And so now looking at these numbers, oops, go back. We see that looking at the review rate, which was the number of papers that were reviewed over the total submissions during this time, we see that while it is still slightly higher for the community, in this comparison, it's not statistically significant, potentially because we need still a higher sample size and a higher N to be able to see that. When we're looking at the accept rate of these papers, and now in this accept rate analysis, we're looking at total accept rate, not just accept rate post-review, for papers that were accepted between January 2022 and June 2022. And we're looking in that time window because that is when our accept rates start to level off. We see that there is a significantly higher percent of papers that are being accepted via community review. And again, we also looked at the publication timeline for those accepted papers. And again, here we see that the community review publication timeline is comparable to direct journal submissions that don't undergo any transfers. And we do see that it seems to be significantly faster for papers that undergo at least 2 or more rounds of transfer. And so some conclusions are, we see that in community review, it appears that there is a larger proportion of manuscripts that are potentially being sent for review. We do see similar post-review accept rates. So we're thinking that manuscripts that are being sent for review are being considered similarly by reviewers ultimately to these direct journal submissions, and that our publication timeline is comparable to the direct journal submissions overall, and potentially slightly faster if papers are going under multiple rounds of editorial reject and transfer. And I just want to end by saying that, this is still a pilot that we're continuing to work on and continuing to try and improve and make better as we kind of see how it's going. And with that, I'll end. And I just want to end by thanking the many people at Cell Press that make a beast like this work. So thank you.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Anybody who's in the room that's interested in asking a question, come to the microphone, identify yourself and your affiliation. Okay.
Hi, Damien Patterson from eLife. So the hypothesis presumably was that you would have a dramatically higher acceptance rate for papers that are submitted to community. Just so I understand it, the community review, you get considered by all journals versus considered by one journal. But yeah, your acceptance rate was basically unchanged.
True, and what I think is probably contributing to that is many authors are withdrawing when they get their, if they've requested Cell and a higher tier journal, and we think, after our editorial evaluations, it's not quite at that level, and we're offering perhaps Cell reports or iScience, authors have the opportunity to withdraw and try elsewhere, and we do see that there is, I think, roughly 40% withdrawal at that step. And if we can better align author expectations and get more of those papers reviewed, I would hope that our accept rate would be higher.
Questions from the room? Do we have questions from virtual attendees? Okay.
Hi, Bennett Holman from Yonsei University. Just a quick clarificatory question. When you say that the timelines are equivalent or faster for the community review paper, are you just looking at the papers for which the publication plan was accepted by the authors?
Correct. These are looking at only accepted papers yeah. We haven't compared directly for rejected papers if we're rejecting papers faster, essentially. Then.
Sorry, for papers for which the author rejects.
Well, those we don't further follow because that's the end point of that paper. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eric Rubin from New England Journal. I'm curious about the burden on editors. Are certain editors ending up with a lot more reviewer assignments as you go to try to farm out? I understand someone has principal responsibility, but they're presumably turning to specialty editors from the journals. And is that working out? How's that working out?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid question. And it's something we've worked a lot on to try and make sure that we're not overburdening journal editors that are already busy with their home journals. And so I think by having both a combination of core community editors that only handle community papers, as well as having the entire Cell Press kind of swath of journal editors when there's papers that really fit certain expertise and journal interests, distributing that way, we have a kind of a big pool of editors to distribute among, so it's not particularly burdensome on any one person.
Take a question from the front of the room here.
Hi, Mario Malichki, Stanford University. This would then imply that the quality of peer review would, in theory, be equal no matter the prestige of the journal. And therefore, the choice in which you decide where this paper is going is not really dependent on the quality of the paper, because the peer review you've done was the same, right? And so we can expect that it's been improved the same across all of your community peer review. So what then makes that selection of, is it needed at that stage? Do you need that peer review to tell you where it goes, or could have that been done by a desk rejection rate as it was done before?
Yeah, so when we are selecting reviewers are told which journals the paper is being considered for. So they do have the journal in mind, and so we are also asking for their opinion of the paper for the journals that we're considering it for. And so in that sense, when, as far as quality of review based on the, we'll say, the impact of the journal, the reviewer is aware of which journal
And
it is.
and
Yeah.
can I ask why? I mean, wouldn't it be great when you're doing this to do a pilot without telling him that and then see where would the paper go? Why do you think that the reviewer needs that information to provide the quality review? Have you seen differences in the quality review that they produce based on which journal they're reviewing for?
There are differences, I'd say, in, when reviewers have certain journals in mind, what they think as far as work that needs to be done to support conclusions to the level and the level of advance needed for journal A versus journal B might be different. And so we would see that the reviewer comments would be different depending on if we're saying this paper is considered for Cell versus Cell reports, as an example. And so we do let the reviewers know which journals have decided to consider the paper.
Do you have any virtual questions, Michael?
None yet.
Okay. Any more in real life questions? I'll take the opportunity to ask a question then. So more than one journal can say that they are interested in the paper. How do you, if both journals end up, does the author then get to decide which one it goes to?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
exactly. If after, review, revision, re-review, multiple journals say we would publish this paper, the author gets to decide which journal they want to end.
So that happens not before the first revision, but
Yeah, that
later in the
happens, yeah,
process.
at the end. And that's.
And you haven't had any fistfights between editors or?
No, that hasn't happened. Luckily, Cell Press is a very collaborative place between journals, so. Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah. Maybe take your question and then,
I just have a quick question. I'm Wendy Sprague. I'm a editor-in-chief at Veterinary Clinical Pathology. It's a small journal. It's a society journal. But are all of the journals the same price? Like because Wiley kind of does something where if I don't think a journal fits mine, they offer these open access journals, and oftentimes they don't even take them because they don't want to pay them money. They're looking for sort of a easy.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, are all of them the same?
No, I mean, so this is not considering the business model of the journal. So those 20 journals include both hybrid and gold open access. And of the open access fees, there are different prices. So that's not something, we're not considering that kind of end stage of the process.
Sorry, maybe I missed it, but if they dedicate one journal or multiple that they want to be considered from, you said the journals get to pick later on, they all are happy with what the end product is. When would not a lower tier journal be happy with the review that was done for a higher journal?
When would so in that case, oftentimes if if multiple journals across tiers all would the final outcome is something that they'd want to publish, that's the author's choice of which tier they want to go to based on.
But they
based on
submitted their
audience.
choice before that. I mean, you gave them the top tier review choice when they decided to go for your top journal. And then all of a sudden 5 or 6 journals won that same paper, right?
So the journals that are being considered, that is decided before the paper is even sent for review. These 6 journals said they were interested in reviewing the paper. It goes out to review for those 6 journals. And let's say it happens to make it for those 6 journals and they're all interested in the final product. The author gets to choose which of those they want to publish in.
But I was more, sorry, maybe I wasn't being clear, but how do you then specify to that one reviewer to consider criteria for these 6 journals? Do you think these 6 journals are so similar that the review quality won't be different for all 6 of them?
So the reviewers do oftentimes delineate, let's say for molecular cell, we think that this needs to be further explored. I wouldn't necessarily require that for Cell reports or for iScience. And then that way, when we do give authors a decision letter that includes the reviews, we can break down the levels of revisions that would be needed for different journals, especially also if journals are of different scopes and that might have slightly different priorities. And so we can kind of have
I
a
mean,
little
just the
more.
last one. Do you have maybe
so
intention to publish?
I think we're at the end of the session, except I want to just make sure there aren't any virtual questions. So we're at time.
No additional questions.
Okay,